One of my favorite things in the Pokemon TCG is gimmick decks. While they're rarely the strongest decks in any given format, they usually change something fundamental about the game, which leads to some very interesting games where you're forced to play in a completely different style so that you can make the most out of your strategy. Kofu, alongside his Crabominable and Veluza, were added to the TCG in the Stellar Crown expansion, and even featured as one of the 4 deck chunks that you could play in the pre-release event for that set. If you went to that event, you probably saw the potential in these cards. Kofu himself is a pretty solid supporter. It lets you place 2 cards from your hand on the bottom of your deck, and then you can draw 4 cards. This lets you save the valuable resources you might need later on in the game, but still lets you dig deeper in your deck, as opposed to something like Professor's Research, which forces you to discard the things in your hand. But the strength of Kofu isn't necessarily in what he does. Both Crabominable and Veluza share the Food Prep ability, which reduces the energy costs of their attacks by 1 colorless energy for each Kofu card in your discard pile. You're allowed 4 Kofus in your deck, so once they're all in the discard pile, you can attack for 4 colorless energies less. That means Veluza attacks for free, and Crabominable can deal a massive 250 damage for a single water energy. So we've found our gimmick, but you can only play 1 supporter card a turn. So doing this naturally means it would take 4 full turns before your Pokemon reach their max potentials. This was the downfall of the deck during the pre-release event. You didn't find Kofu fast enough, you'd be too far behind by the time you could do anything. In a standard 60 card deck though, there are plenty of ways to speed this up. Cards that have a discard cost like Ultra Ball or Earthen Vessel can discard Kofus. Cards that discard your hand like Professor's Research or Carmine can discard Kofus. Cards that discard from your deck like Brilliant Blender or Explorer's Guidance can also discard Kofus. We're going to say Kofu a lot in this video, let's just get over it. With the right sequence of cards, you can be attacking with a Crabominable as early as your second turn and dealing enough damage to kill most common 2-prize Pokemon while only giving up a single prize yourself. It creates a very engaging playstyle where the entire mission of your deck becomes to find and discard all 4 Kofus as fast as possible. Let's take a look at the deck. Here is my current Kofu build, and I would like to stress the my part. This is not a deck that's really shown up in tournaments. You don't see it very often in TCG Live, and it doesn't really get talked about all that much. There isn't really a best way to build it compared to a deck like Charizard or Ancient Box, where only 1 or 2 cards will change from player to player. In fact, there are completely different styles of Kofu you can play, depending on some of the deck building choices you make, but we'll get to that later. Starting with the Pokemon, we of course have the Kofu chunk of the deck. For me, that is a 4/4 Crabominable line and 2 Veluza. Crabominable isn't a small Pokemon with 160 HP, but it does have a name that's very hard to say. Either way, 160 HP is still not going to be enough to survive for very long against most decks, so a full 4/4 line makes sense. Veluza on the other hand is only situationally useful, dealing 110 damage but having a shred effect, meaning that it can get through things like Cornerstone Ogerpon. So I think 2 of them is enough, but you could go down to 1 or even 0 if you find that they don't tend to do very much for you. For our Crabrawlers, we have 2 options, but honestly it doesn't really matter. Both have 90 HP, so Buddy Poffins are unfortunately off limits for them, but the Obsidian Flames version does require some fighting energy, and we're only using water energy in this deck. So I prefer to run the Stellar Crown version on the off chance we do end up actually attacking with it. Both Crabominable and Veluza need the food prep ability, so obviously we don't have any options there. There is a very nice full art Crabominable that you could go for. The only other Pokemon in the deck is a 2/2 line of the Dunsparce. This is a really cool card that I have not really found a home for in my own testing yet, but it works really well in this deck. It has the dual function of letting you draw a ton of cards, but also giving you a pivot. Crabominable's attack is very strong, but he can't use it twice in a row. So if it does actually survive your opponent's turn, you need to shift it to the bench and then back to the active to get another attack off. The Dunsparce gives us this option. For the Dunsparce, I run the Temporal Forces version as it has a free retreat cost, and pivoting is so important, I don't think this is optional. But if you do only have the Paldea Evolved version, you can get away with it. You'll just have to evolve before you pivot. You could go up to 3-3 if you want, and it would give you even more draw power, but we aren't running the Poffins in this version of the deck, so I think it would be quite hard to get the third one out, so I don't run it. While my Pokemon lineup is relatively slim, there are definitely a lot more options if you want to use them. We of course start with the usual suspects who are, as always, great inclusions in the deck. Squawkabilly lets you turbo through your deck at the cost of potentially discarding useful resources. Mew and Pheasantipity both give you more draw power, and in the case of Mew, another easy pivot. And Luminion lets you grab a Kofu straight out of the deck. I choose not to use any of these for the simple reason that they give up 2 prize cards. I found one of the biggest strengths with this deck is the inevitability of it. You can afford to give up 3 or sometimes even 4 prize cards in some matchups, because once you get going, you're going to take 2 prizes every single turn. Adding 2 prize stuff to your bench gives your opponent a way to speed up the clock, possibly ending the game before your strategy gets going. Cleffa, on the other hand, is a fantastic single prize option that fills a similar role to Mew, and honestly, if I'd thought of it before I built the deck, I probably would have included it. It's completely conceivable that you have turns where you don't have anything better to do, so Grasping Draw is a great option to get you closer to your next Kofu. Similarly, the Tatsugiri Rescue Board combo is a great pivoting option that gets you more chances to find your Kofus every turn. I do find the deck often has space for extra Pokemon to sit on the bench because we never really fill it up. So tech choices like Mimikyu, Fluttermane, Klefki, Spiritomb, Iron Bundle, or even Genesect could all be solid single prize options that can help shift certain matchups in your favor. Basically, if it can sit on your bench and it's useful, it can go in the deck. The supporter lineup is very simple. As you would expect, we're running 4 Kofus. While we'd usually like to use a different supporter and discard the Kofus directly, there's absolutely no harm in just using it if you don't have a better option for turn. It is still good. A full playset of Professor's Research gives us a powerful discard engine that can also help us dig through the deck much faster. Sometimes it can be a little awkward if your hand has energy or evolution Pokemon in it, but most of the time you can play the important stuff before using it, so it works out quite well. 2 Morty's Conviction gives us an extra way to draw more cards while discarding Kofu at the same time, without discarding important things. It's kind of the opposite of the Professor's Research. Morty is particularly strong against decks that flood the board like Terrapagos or Miraidon, potentially drawing you up to 8 cards. The ratio between these two can be tweaked to your liking if you find Research is discarding important stuff too often, or your meta has a lot of Area 0 decks in it. You might want to run more Mortys and less Researches, but in essence they do fill kind of the same role. The final 2 supporters I run are 2 copies of Kieran and a single copy of Black Belt's Training. Both are damage boosts which allow Crabominable to hit hard enough to kill V-Stars, and Kieran's switching effect can also be useful to help move a Crabominable out of the active after it's attacked to help keep your momentum going. While these are the ones that I've chosen, again there is plenty of options. Carmine lets you start drawing through your deck on turn 1 for a much more aggressive strategy. Irida lets you grab any item you want and a Crabominable or a Veluza. Arven gives you an easy way to access the tools in the deck. Disruption supporters like Iona or Judge can slow down your opponent while you set up your discard pile. Arazu and Jack can give you easy access to your evolutions. For the Ace spec, there are 2 clear options: Secret Box and Brilliant Blender. Secret Box is what I prefer to run as it allows you a lot of flexibility in grabbing the exact combination of cards you need for any given turn, while Brilliant Blender cuts out the middleman and just directly discards all 4 of your Kofus as soon as you use it. The choices you make in the supporter and Ace spec lineup will really be the thing that dictates how your deck plays out. A build running Brilliant Blender won't need to discard so aggressively, so can run a supporter lineup with Arvens and Jacks for a more stable setup, at the cost of having to find the blender. A build with Carmine and Squawkabillies can discard much more aggressively, potentially seeing all of the Kofus in the discard pile as early as turn 1, and having the option to choose a completely different Ace spec. My build is more of a slow and steady approach, accepting that some things will die early on and aiming to have a Crabominable online by around turn 3, and then turning the game around in the later stages with favourable prize trades. Our Pokemon search lineup is relatively simple. 4 Nest Balls, 4 Ultra Balls. I don't know why I emphasized the balls there. Nest Ball gets our basics out, Ultra Ball discards Kofu, and gets our evolutions. You can run Poffins for the Dunsparces as well, but I haven't found them necessary yet. I think in some builds you would. 4 Pokegears give us another way to dig deeper to find Kofu, so you want to be using those as often as possible. 2 Super Rods gives us some recovery if we need to discard energies or Pokemon with early Professor's Research, or if the opponent targets down Dunsparce to inhibit our draw engine. 2 switches help get Crabominable out of the active after attacking, and finally 4 Pokemon catchers give us a gusting option to help take knockouts on important targets. I'll be honest here, Counter Catcher is better. Most of the time with this build you'll be going behind early, so Counter Catcher will usually be online for most of the game. Pokemon Catcher does let you take wins in late game scenarios where you and your opponent are both on 2 prizes though, and this isn't a super serious deck and coin flips can be exciting, so I went with the Pokemon Catchers. Tools play a surprisingly interesting role in the deck, even though we aren't running Arven to search them out directly. Choice Belt gives Crabrawler the extra 30 damage he needs to knock out any V-Star. Defiance Band gives you an extra 30 for larger EXs like the new Evolutions, but you do have to be behind. Both of them you can play pretty much as soon as you draw them because you're always going to be putting them on a Crabrawler and you're not going to want to discard them. The Evolution gives you an optional way to set up either your Crabominables or your Dunsparces, and that is a hard sentence to say. It also has a very interesting interaction with Veluza, as the Evolution attack only costs a single colorless energy. So with 1 Kofu in the discard pile, Veluza can use it for free. This is just like Cramorant from the Lost Zone deck, who can do the same thing. This also applies to other TMs, so things like TM Crisis Punch, TM Devolution, or TM Blindside can all be solid options in the deck if you're running Arven, and can be used by Veluza for no energy. For stadiums, there is one clear choice. Our basics cannot be searched with Poffins, and we do not have rule boxes, so Artisan is the natural pick. Artisan also lets you make a cute play with Dunsparce, where you use the Runaway Draw ability to shuffle it back into the deck after drawing 3 cards, then use your Artisan to immediately get Dunsparce back on the bench, ready to evolve again next turn. This kind of loop can go turn after turn until your opponent gets rid of your Artisan, letting you draw massive amounts of cards. Gravity Mountain is an interesting stadium that gives us an extra way to take out large targets. It causes Stage 2 Pokemon to lose 30 HP, so Charizard becomes 300 HP, Dragapult becomes 290, and Gardevoir becomes 280. These are all quite easy numbers to hit compared to their normal HP. A combination of Defiance Band and Black Belt Training will give you an extra 70 damage, allowing you to hit 320, which is enough to kill Dragapult but not quite enough to kill Charizard. Gravity Mountain bridges that little gap. This is a constant effect, so you do not need to have it in play before you attack for its effect to be helpful. You might have a scenario where you can use a Black Belt's Training and Crabominable to deal 290 damage to a Dragapult EX, leaving it with 30 HP. Your opponent might retreat it to try and keep it alive, but when you play Gravity Mountain it will lose 30 HP and immediately be knocked out, even if it's on the bench. So even if you can't immediately kill a large target, sometimes it's still worth dealing the damage to them. Finally, we have our energy, and my build does not have a lot. 4 water energies, 2 reversal energies. Reversal energy is a whole thing that catches many people out. Basically, this card is 3 of any type of energy as long as it's attached to an evolution Pokemon and you're behind on prizes. It is a little complicated, but what it means for us is that when we're behind, we only need 2 Kofu in the discard or Crabominable to be able to attack. This is another reason why I prefer the slow and steady approach with the deck, as this kind of energy stops working when you're ahead, so it might not work as well in more turbo style decks. And decks that don't run reversal energy are very reliant on getting all 4 Kofus into the discard pile, and sometimes one will be prized, so you can't. Like I said before, this is my version of the deck currently. I make no claims that this is the best possible version, but it's what's been working for me. We take a slow and steady approach, taking advantage of the fact that our opponent needs 6 knockouts to win, which gives us the time to find the pieces we need to swing the momentum in our favour later in the game. It's a bit like how a Charizard deck plays. If that's not your style though, you might want to try a different kind of build. So let's take a look at a couple of those. I've used the word turbo a few times throughout the video, but for those of you who might be less familiar, basically turbo decks want to go as fast as possible and take quick knockouts. Things like Miraidon, Raging Bull, or Roaring Moon EX are all typically turbo decks that you might see quite often. Generally, the idea is always the same. Fly through your deck as fast as possible to find the key pieces you need to enable your setup. For Miraidon, that's things like electric generators. For Raging Bolt, it's things like Professor Sada's Vitality. And for Roaring Moon, it's usually things like Dark Patch. And for Turbo Kofu, well, it's Kofu. This version of Kofu is more focused on this turbo style, aiming to discard as much of the deck as possible, as fast as possible. Hopefully, in your early turns, you're able to get all 4 Kofus into your hand and then into the discard. The downside to this kind of build is that if they're hiding at the bottom of your deck, you can really struggle to get going. The biggest change in this build is the inclusion of the 2 prize support suite, which is very powerful but also a liability. Your opponent will be able to use gusting effects to potentially win the game in 3 turns if they knock out your support lineup, which means you have to get your attacks off fast. Carmine and Squawkabilly both combine to give you an incredibly powerful first turn where you can potentially get through a quarter of your deck before your opponent even starts playing. Followed up by a Professor's Research on turn 2, it's completely feasible to have half of your deck gone by the end of your second turn. To guarantee that we do find some Kofus to discard, this build is running 2 of the Luminions. Even in the worst case, if you do end up benching both, you're guaranteeing 2 Kofus, so with a Reversal Energy or a Double Turbo Energy, both Veluza and Crabominable can attack. We also include Pokestop as the build is very heavy on items, and it has the chance to just discard Kofu anyway, and the Trekking Shoes to accelerate even further. Night Stretchers help get back our Pokemon and our energies, as it's very likely we'll have to throw a few of them away. The main benefit to this kind of build is that both Secret Box and Brilliant Blender aren't really necessary. We can go for an aspect like Prime Catcher to help target down key Pokemon from your opponent's board. The biggest sacrifice though is we lose a lot of access to the cute plays the deck can make, such as the damage boosting cards or the TM plays. Many of these kinds of cards need to be played at specific times, and we're probably going to discard our hand every turn. So they're probably just going to end up getting discarded, and that makes them not worth running. Brilliant Blender takes the deck in the complete opposite direction, giving us the chance to play a more standard style of deck. You still get to take advantage of the powerful food prep ability, but maintain the more consistent style of get whatever card you need every turn that you'll find in a lot of the other top decks. As we'll be using the blender to directly bin our Kofus as soon as possible, we can replace the entire suite of discard supporters with Arvans and Iridas, who both let us grab the blender and either a Pokemon or a tool card. Including the Irida also gives us an easy avenue to access Luminion for specific supporters like Boss's Orders when we need it, Iron Bundle for gusting, and Manaphy for bench protection. The inclusion of Arven lets us directly search the tools that we need, so TM Evolution becomes a very reliable way to get Crabominable online, and TM Crisis Punch and TM Devolution both become very viable ways to end the game. If you're willing to include 2 prizes, then Mew and Pheasantipity can both provide solid draw engines, letting you drop the Dunsparces, or you can stick with single prizes and include some Poffins, which both Arven and Irida can grab, which lets you get your Dunsparces out more reliably. The other benefit to this kind of strategy is we don't need to lean as heavily on discard cards to make the deck work. This leaves a lot of space for different tech choices like Klefki, TM Devolution, or even stadiums like Temple of Sinnoh. The downside, though, is if Blender is prized, you are screwed. You cannot play the game anymore. Both of these alternative versions are not decks that I've spent a ton of time testing, so they can definitely be improved on. But I wanted to show them because usually I tend to go over some combos or specific lines that the deck I'm covering can do, but this deck is pretty simple. Get Kofu, discard Kofu, do damage. Instead, showing you different versions of the deck can highlight the flexibility of some of these gimmick-style decks. Because they're changing the way the game plays in some fashion, you are left with a very clear goal of what you need to accomplish. This deck wants to discard Kofus. United Wings wants to discard birds. Festival Lead needs to get the stadium out. How you go about obtaining the goal of your gimmick deck can vary massively depending on your playstyle and what meta you're playing in. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at a slightly more off-meta deck with me, and if you do end up playing Kofu yourself, let me know what build you settled on. It's always interesting to hear how each player ends up building this kind of deck. I'm aiming to have the gameplay video out in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime though, I'm going to try and never say the word crabominable again, because this has taken far too long to record. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.